Let's discuss a few different properties of technology. And in particular, we're going to discuss two different properties. The first one is going to be monotonic, or monotonicity. And the idea here is that you increase the amount of at least one input it should be possible to produce at least as much output as before. So hopefully, not hopefully, but usually more, right? If we have more inputs, we get more output. But if we kept all the inputs fixed, that we increased one of these inputs by a bit more, we should be at least able to produce what we did before, and maybe even more as before. This is often, or sometimes called, free disposal. In the sense that, if you have too many inputs, if you have more inputs and you don't want to use them, you could freely dispose of these extra inputs. So it's never actually going to harm your production to have more inputs than you need in some way, or you're not going to be able to produce less because you have to pay to get rid of it or something like that. You can freely dispose of inputs, of extra inputs. All right, so that's the first property. The second one is going to have to do with convexity again, just like we saw with the difference curve. So let's erase this and talk a bit about convexity when we're applying it to these production functions. Second property is convexity. I'll just write convex here. So we're often going to assume that technology is convex or has the property of convexity. Often we will assume technology. So technology being, technology is determining the shapes of those isoquants. And we're going to usually assume that technology that's giving that shape of that isoquant is convex. So it's very similar to those indifference curves. If we had two ways of producing some amount of production, for example, we have method 1, which uses x1 units of input 1 and x2 units of input 2. And we could have maybe some other method which had z1 units of input 1 and z2 units of input 2. Well, a convex production means that a weighted average of these two methods will produce at least as much of output as these ones on their own. A convex production or with convex production / technology, a weighted average of these two methods, of these two production methods. So it could be 50-50 or it could be 75-25, whichever way, is going to produce at least as much of either of these two methods. These two production methods will produce at least as much production as either of these methods alone. So for instance, if this amount, example, it's some amount y that we're producing, we can produce y units with this much of input 1 or this much and this much of input 2, or this other method that uses a different combination of these inputs. All we're saying is that a weighted average of these two methods is going to produce at least as much y. At least as much output as y. Y is at least the smallest amount we're going to get from giving a weighted average of these two methods. And if it's like strictly convex, it would produce more. So it's very similar to that idea of convexity when we talked about indifference curves. That a weighted average is going to produce more, at least as much, than either of these two extremes. It's the same idea here.